Today's video is going to be so exciting, especially for me, probably mostly for me, less for you. I get to talk about my top 30 movies of all time, ever, including non-horror. I just thought, since I have a bunch of new subscribers coming in, you know, I just recently hit 200,000, what a good way to celebrate than to share my personal favorite movies, and you can kind of get to know me a little bit better through finding out what my favorite movies are. A lot of these are going to stay consistent throughout my entire life and are probably never going to change. Obviously, we get new releases though all the time, so this can change. This is just my top 30 at the current point in time. In fact, one of these movies is actually from 2021. I want to clarify that these are my top favorite 30 movies. These aren't necessarily the best 30 movies I've ever seen quality-wise. So if I had to go to a deserted island, for instance, these are the 30 movies that I would take with me. Before we get into my favorite movies of all time, I just want to thank NordVPN for sponsoring today's video. This is especially going to come in handy for today's video because, like usual, I will tell you where everything is streaming right now so you can watch all of my favorite movies. And how does a VPN help you with that, you might ask? Well, firstly, a VPN is really useful in today's online world because it makes hacking close to impossible. It protects your data and privacy with their double data encryption. But of course, my favorite feature is that you can access any country's streaming service selection with just one click on NordVPN. They make it so easy. All you have to do is click on the country that you want to connect to, refresh your streaming service, and bam, it's like your computer or your phone is in that country with access to all of their streaming. And you can use it on up to 6 devices, so all of your technology is protected. So go to nordvpn.com/PossessedbyHorror to get a 2-year plan plus an additional month with a huge discount. It's completely risk-free because NordVPN has a 30-day money-back guarantee. Okay, so I did separate my list into horror movies and non-horror movies. Originally, I was going to do it just kind of sporadically, staggered throughout a list, but I figured some of you are probably only going to be interested in my favorite horror movies, even though I think last year or the year before I did a top 10 favorite horror movies of all time, so you kind of have a sneak peek into that. Also, I've done top movies to get to know me, like as a person, and some of my favorites are indeed on that list as well. So some of these are going to be repetitive for some of you if you've been watching for a while. Also, these are not ranked in any way. I cannot torture myself like that, so this is an arbitrary ranking. However, or arbitrary list. I'm just gonna list them out. However, the last movie I'm gonna talk about is my favorite movie of all time. If you wanna take a guess, if you've been around a while, you already know what it is. Leave a comment. So starting off, we have horror movies. These are my favorite horror movies. First up, we have The Ring. I bet you thought this was gonna be the last one I talk about, didn't you? You thought it was gonna be my #1 favorite of all time? While a reporter is investigating her niece's death, she discovers a videotape that is said to kill you after 7 days. This is an obvious choice for me. You saw this coming on this list, so I thought we'd just get it out of the way right off the bat, and I can explain to you that this is, in fact, my favorite horror movie of all time. I think it is the most effective. It's in my favorite era of horror, which is early 2000s, and I can't fault it. There's really nothing wrong with this movie, and in my opinion is a perfect horror movie. Next up, we have The Blair Witch Project. 3 college students set off into the woods to film a documentary about the Blair Witch. So I know this movie is going to be on a lot of people's favorites lists, especially in the horror genre, but I do credit this movie, The Blair Witch Project, to kind of the onset of the found footage subgenre of horror. Even though it wasn't the original, it really did become popular after this movie came out, so to me, it just really transformed the genre. It's so well done with such a low budget, basically no budget, and it's perfect. Next up, we have my favorite horror classic, just my personal go-to. This is going to differ for everyone, but you know, the like first 4 or 5 franchises of horror from, you know, 60s, 70s, 80s, all those. We have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It is my favorite slasher movie. It is my favorite classic horror movie, if you will. I think it just works so well. I'm obsessed with this movie. I love everything about it. It can never be replicated because of the disturbing aspects that went on behind the scenes. I did do a whole video on toxic horror movie sets for specifically Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I also did The Shining, if you're curious. It doesn't make me dislike this movie a lot, but it is kind of disturbing information to know about the film. It's just done so well, and it was just executed so well, and I love all of the performances, and I'm not typically one to gravitate towards older movies. I like the ones from my era, which is early 2000s. I think we all kind of gravitate more towards the ones we grew up on. Not everyone, there's exceptions to that, but me personally, I gravitate towards the movies I grew up on. But the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre will always be in my top favorite horror movies because it is just So well done. Next is a movie that instantly went into my top 10 favorite horror movies as soon as I saw it, and that is Gonjiam Haunted Asylum. This follows a group of friends who decide to live stream their exploration of the abandoned Gonjiam Asylum. This is easily the scariest movie I have ever seen in my life, and it's in the best way possible. It's in a way that I can rewatch it. I want to revisit it constantly. If a movie can make me feel fear like that and feel discomfort in a really entertaining way, yeah, it's gonna make it to my favorites. Has a slower start, not my favorite beginning of a horror movie, but I do like the exposition of it, and I like the setup and the build-up, and the fact that there's technology involved with them live streaming. It feels very modern and just fits in today's world, and it just adds to the horror. Next up, we have Starry Eyes. This follows a young aspiring actress trying to catch her big break while also dealing with her mental health when she gets the opportunity of a lifetime. This is my favorite movie to recommend to people who are looking for underrated horror, because I don't think this one is as widely known. However, I do see more and more people talking about it, so I think people are catching on that this movie is incredible. I think it's an interesting take on Hollywood and the LA scene and the extent that people will go to, the lengths that they'll go to in order to succeed. I love all the characters, even the ones that you're supposed to hate. I think they're so well written, and I love everything about this movie. You want body horror? There's a scene in this movie that is just so good. Next up, you knew this was gonna be on the list if you've been watching me for a while. Triangle. How many times can I talk about Triangle on this channel? It's going to be endless. I'm gonna warn you about that. Every time I get a chance to talk about it, I'm gonna be talking about it. So a mother agrees to go sailing with a friend when their boat capsizes and they must find refuge on a larger boat that appears to be abandoned. This is another favorite of mine to recommend to people who've never seen it, because it's almost a guarantee that you'll at least enjoy it on an entertainment level. It's not the best movie in the world, but for entertainment purposes, this movie is phenomenal. It's definitely more of a psychological thriller than a horror movie, but it does have horror elements. But it's one of the most trippy, well done movies from that decade, and I am obsessed with this movie. Next up, we have Gretel and Hansel. So Gretel and Hansel, starving, must find refuge in the forest when they stumble upon a witch's cottage who seems to be a little bit too good to be true. I saw this movie twice in theaters when it came out in 2020, early 2020. Stunning visuals. The story I absolutely love. I'm really into witchy stuff anyway, and I love all of that, all those aspects, all the witchy elements in this. The score for this is incredible, and obviously visually it's just beautiful. There's so many things about this that just speak to me personally that maybe won't translate for all of you. I know this isn't super well loved or even really talked about, but for me personally, with the visuals, the score, the story, the performances, all of it works for me, all of it speaks to me, and I can't really fault it. The end gets a little bit weak, but generally, this is just one of my favorites. Next up, we have another classic horror movie in my opinion, and that is The Thing. A group of research scientists take in a dog which proceeds to attack some of their team, and soon an unknown shape-shifting entity is unleashed. This just has really impressive practical effects, especially for its time, and it's kind of disappointing and sad to hear that it didn't really gain a lot of popularity until years later when it became a cult classic. It kind of gained a cult following years later, so they didn't really make a profit on this movie, which is unfortunate because this movie is obviously so well done, and it's hands down my favorite Alien movie. If you want practical effects that are so good in an alien setting, you obviously have to watch The Thing. I'm sure you've seen it though. I'm sure everyone has seen it by now. Next up, we have The Loved Ones. So this follows a young girl who gets turned down to the prom by her crush, but that's okay because she just kidnaps him and makes him celebrate their own prom. This is a highly underrated Australian movie. I do see people talk about it all the time, but it's more of a niche movie I feel that not everyone knows about, but everyone needs to be watching it. It is a teen horror, but it's definitely one of the most gruesome teen horrors that I've ever seen. It's very gory and quite disturbing, I would say. A lot of times teen horror can end up on the cheesier end of the spectrum, but this one definitely is a more serious tone and definitely way more gruesome and brutal and gory and messed up. Next, 13 Ghosts. A struggling family inherits a house that seems a little bit too good to be true. This is just my go-to comfort horror movie for me, and I actually surprisingly don't have too many of those. When I think of comfort movies, I typically think of a lot of non-horror movies, which you're gonna find out a lot of those in the second part of this video. But this is just one that I can watch over and over and over again. I never get tired of it. It's just so well done. I love the campiness of it, the era, obviously early 2000s. I love the history of it with me personally, just from my childhood. I used to go have sleepovers at my friend's house, and we would sleep in her sister's room when she was away, and on the ceiling was a poster for 13 Ghosts, and it scared me so bad. I struggled sleeping there every single time because I would just stare at all these faces on the poster staring back at me, and it traumatized me to the point where I refused to watch this movie. And then my stepbrother would tell me about the Juggernaut who would break people in half, and I was like, absolutely not. I'm not gonna watch that. Keep in mind, I was 11 when this movie came out, so 11, 12, that's before I really got into horror. Anyway, I eventually watched it. It was not as bad as I thought. I thought it was gonna be really disturbing and messed up. Obviously, I'm in love with this movie now. Okay, next up we have Misery. Writer Paul Sheldon suffers a car accident but is soon rescued by his #1 fan, Annie Wilkes, who promises to nurse him back to health. This is my favorite Stephen King adaptation by far. This is just one I love rewatching in the wintertime. The performances, the storyline, everything about it just really appeals to me. I really don't think any other Stephen King adaptation can even come close to Misery. I think Kathy Bates is obviously the perfect choice to play Annie Wilkes. I just love everything about this movie, and I really don't see another Stephen King adaptation coming close to it. Okay, next one is a controversial choice to put on this list. This is the one from 2021. I don't want to say it's my absolute favorite from the year, because if you watch my best and worst of 2021 horror movies, you'll know the reasoning behind this, but Last Night in Soho. An aspiring fashion designer moves to London to go to fashion school, but soon realizes it isn't everything she dreamed it to be. She begins having visions of the past, but can she really rely on them to tell her the truth? I had to put this in my top 30 movies of all time because of the amount of times I could probably watch this. I watched it twice within 48 hours. I got it immediately the day it came out, obviously. I'll never be able to truly put into words what this movie means to me. I have a lot of personal reasons why I'm drawn to this storyline. I used to study fashion. I knew people like Jocasta. It's just a lot of personal things about this movie. To me, it's the most rewatchable on this entire list. Every time I finish watching this movie, I want to immediately start it again, or the next day I'll be thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about this movie. Even if I love a movie, even if I do think it's rewatchable, typically I need like a couple months in between each viewing. Not with Last Night in Soho. This is going to be on my TV constantly. I feel bad for my partner. He's not a huge fan of this one. Up next, we have Silent Hill. I think this one might be a little bit controversial to include, but I'm gonna include it anyway. So a mother and daughter become stranded in a supposed abandoned town of Silent Hill, which at dark becomes your worst nightmare. I love this movie. I love everything about it, obviously. I don't need to say that for every single movie on this list, because you know that. It's in my top favorites for a reason. But the era this movie came out in, I was 16 years old. It was just such a good time. The setting of Silent Hill, the horror elements, and then when I found out recently, when I rewatched it, that the dialogue in it is intentional and it's supposed to replicate the dialogue from the video games. That just made me love it even more. I do have the games now, and I will be playing them eventually because I am obsessed with the concept of Silent Hill. I love everything about Silent Hill. I love the horror aspects, the monsters, if you will. So yeah, to put it in movie form, it's phenomenal. Obviously the sequel is a little lacking. I do own it. I do watch it for, you know, to get a little bit more Silent Hill, but it's obviously not as well executed as the original. Next up, we have a movie called The Hole. A group of friends decide to party in an abandoned bunker underground when they soon find themselves trapped below and running out of resources. This one is so underrated, and I recently rediscovered this movie. I had kind of forgotten about it, and then I decided to buy it because I was craving a rewatch, and then upon the rewatch, I was like, oh my god, this movie is fantastic. Like, so underrated. I mean, the early 2000s vibes, fashion, setting, everything about that obviously does something for me. This is definitely the most serious teen horror, I think. Maybe not ever, but that I've seen and that I would recommend, because I know teen horror isn't a genre for everyone, but there's something about this one in particular that is not cheesy at all. It's not goofy. Even if you hear the plot or you see the trailer, it might sound a little bit cheesy. Also, don't read the plot online. It spoils everything. Okay. But I really think everyone would get something out of this movie. Everyone would enjoy this movie to an extent, even if you're generally not a huge fan of teen horror. Next up, we have Thai horror movie Shudder. A couple hits a pedestrian while driving, and soon the photographer boyfriend begins seeing apparitions in his photography. This is probably my number 1 or number 2. It's tied up there with Gone GM of my favorite foreign horror movie. There is a difficult scene in this one. Maybe check trigger warnings for that, but I love this movie, and I don't want to say too much about it, but what it like turns into. There's so much to the story that's really unexpected, and the horror elements in this are phenomenal. I know that the remake, the American remake, some people suggest that. I think the original Thai is always going to be top tier. Anyway, moving on, we have Sunshine, a sci-fi horror. With our sun dying and the end of humanity in sight, a crew is sent to the sun with a device to reactivate it. However, a grave mistake puts their mission in a tailspin. This is hands down my favorite space horror movie. It has everything that I want from that subgenre. It has amazing space visuals. You get to see Mercury pass across the sun. It is gorgeous, stunning, especially if you love space or sci-fi movies. It also has very disturbing visuals. Some of the best horror elements I've seen in this subgenre. It has really cool death scenes. It has a great story despite it being a little over the top. This isn't one that's necessarily believable, but it does feel like it could be set in a near future or in our reality. So for the last movie in this section for my favorite horror movies, we have M. Night Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense. Did you think I was gonna say old? I bet you got a little scared. A psychiatrist works with a young boy who sees visions of ghosts surrounding him. I have to give a little bit of love to M. Night Shyamalan in my top 30 because I do love his movies despite my criticisms of them in the past. I think I talked about it in my old review if you want to check it out. I do love old, just to give you a little preface there. But Sixth Sense is hands down his best movie. I don't think he'll ever be able to top it. No offense, M. Night, but it is the best movie that he's ever done. Toni Collette is in it. Haley Joel Osment, obviously. I think people forget Toni Collette is in this movie. It's kind of her first horror movie and first start that she had at horror. But yeah, like all the other horror movies on this list, I love everything about it. And it's definitely rewatchable. It's another one that traumatized me as a child. I probably watched it way too young and it scared me a lot. Specifically, the gun boy. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, there you have my top 17 horror movies of all time, or, you know, the horror movies that are in my top 30 movies of all time. Let's move on to non-horror. But first I'm gonna take a water break because my voice is going. So first up for non-horror, we have Girl Interrupted. Set in the 1960s, Joanna is admitted to a psych ward for troubled girls after a mental breakdown. So this is actually based on a true story of Susanna Kaysen and her experience at the psych ward. And I think this has some of the best cast for a movie like this. I love every member of the cast. You'll see a lot of early 2000s stars like Angelina Jolie, obviously, but Clea Duvall. I've obviously always been interested in psychology. That's what my degree is in, but also I've always been fascinated by our history of treatment of psychological illnesses and psych wards in the past, and obviously that alone is very horrific. But I really love this movie's take on it. It's a very heavy type movie, but I love the characters. It almost doesn't feel like a full story. It just kind of feels like one of those movies where it just is a series of events that take place, not necessarily a slice of life, but just a series of events that take place over 18 months of Susanna at this psych ward. Next up, we have Melancholia. You knew this was going to be on here. Arguably could be a horror movie, depending on the mindset that you're in. Some people are very traumatized by this movie. Some people refuse to watch it. And I get it. This follows two sisters and their lives days before a rogue planet is said to be heading towards Earth. This is my ideal type of movie. Has horror elements, another planet in the sky, beautiful visuals. Like, I'm obsessed with these kind of visuals. It's definitely one of the most beautiful movies I've ever seen and one of the most hypnotizing endings I've ever seen. I actually had to go back and rewatch it like 3 times in a row. When I first saw this movie, I just kept rewatching the end. Like, I'm fascinated by it. Obviously, this is done by Lars von Trier, and it is part of his Depression trilogy, and this is easily one of the best depictions of depression that I've ever seen in media. However, I do not want to seek out his other movies in the depression trilogy, Nymphomaniac and Antichrist. You can keep those. I'm okay. I don't need them. But this one is gorgeous and stunning story, so good. It's set up in 2 different chapters. You really should push through the first one. It's very long and drawn out, and some people say boring, but I think it really gives good storyline and build up to what happens in the second half of the movie. Next up, we have Prisoner of Azkaban. Obviously, or should I say Harry Potter and Prisoner of Azkaban. This represents the franchise as a whole, in my opinion, because obviously I'd like to take all of them to a deserted island, but if that's not possible, I will be bringing Prisoner of Azkaban. Alfonso Cuarón directed this one. He really should have directed the rest of them. Can you imagine his touch on the Deathly Hallows and like the horrors of that? Would have been so good. He just has such a good tone for the Harry Potter franchise. He also made Gravity with Sandra Bullock. Anyway, Harry Potter in general obviously had to be on this list somewhere, but specifically Prisoner of Azkaban is my favorite. Oh, next up we have 13. Love this movie. This follows honor student Tracy, who befriends a bad influence Evie, who convinces her to experiment with drugs and explore her sexuality and steal from others to go on shopping sprees. I heard someone say that this is Euphoria before Euphoria, except that they're 13, which makes it way more uncomfortable. Then, well, I guess Euphoria is pretty uncomfortable as well. I was actually literally 13 when this movie came out, so for me, it's just like a little extra bonus. The fact that I could fit myself right into the era that this was filmed in, like, it just is a very personal movie for me. But yeah, the movie's incredible. The performances are perfection. I love everything about 13. Next up, we have Devil Wears Prada. This feels very weird to talk about Devil Wears Prada on my horror channel. So Andy, a journalist, gets a job at Runway magazine with no background in fashion and becomes an assistant to prestigious editor-in-chief Miranda Priestley. I watched this so many times in my late teens and early 20s when I was studying fashion. I was obsessed with it. Now it's become the ultimate comfort movie for me. I'm very happy I decided not to work in fashion ever in my life. It's just not for me, but I thought it was. I think America's Next Top Model, Project Runway, and this movie really made me feel like I could do fashion or like could be in the industry. No. Anyway, I still watch this over and over again. It's very much a comfort movie for me. I'll just throw it on if I really don't know what else to watch. Next, we have The Lovely Bones. A young girl is abducted and murdered, and she must help her dad solve the mystery of her death from the other side. This was my favorite movie of all time until my number 1 came around. You might know it already, you probably already commented it, but this one was my favorite up until that point. The visuals were my first kind of introduction to this like big world and like weird imagery kind of thing. I don't know how to put it into words exactly. Like my phone background, you know, it's just kind of like strange images of, I don't know how to explain it. But this was kind of my first introduction to that and how I really fell in love with it. And I think it looked like a lot of my personal dreams that I was having at the time. Same thing with Melancholia. I had dreams like that all the time. Hopefully I'm not clairvoyant. I am a Pisces sun in the 12th house, so I could have some psychic abilities there. But The Lovely Bones is a stunning movie. I love the story. I think the cast is perfect. This is one of my favorite roles for Stanley Tucci, which is controversial because he plays a creep, but he just does it so well that it makes me hate him. And that's so hard because he's obviously in Devil Wears Prada as well, and I saw that first. So the fact that I could feel so strongly about him in this role, he just is so good at what he does. I feel like that they deal with the dark material in The Lovely Bones really, really well and make it not too gratuitous or disturbing. Like, it's obviously unsettling, but it doesn't cross the line to being very, very disturbing, which I really appreciate because I read the book. I don't really like the book. I like the movie more. I just felt like there were a lot of slower parts in the book, and I don't feel as drawn to Susie in the book as I do in the movie for some reason. Maybe it's because I watched the movie first and so many times, and I obviously love it, that I expected something certain from the book, but I just feel like it was a little bit more graphic, obviously, in the in the scenes, certain scenes. So I just care for the movie more. I did end up getting rid of the book. It's just not for me. Next up, we have Downsizing. This movie just makes me feel so good inside. It's just such a comfy movie. I love this movie. A man and his wife decide to undergo the process of becoming small in order to live the life of luxury until his wife backs out at the last minute and he must make a life for himself on his own. This is my #1 go-to comfort horror movie. Comfort movie. Sorry, not a horror. I just think it is so underrated. I know hearing the description and maybe seeing a trailer, it's portrayed as this really, really goofy, over-the-top storyline that's just silly. But it's so much more than that. Like, it becomes a completely different movie once he becomes small and he's living in this small world. Like, it's a beautiful story, honestly, which sounds weird, but if you've never seen it, you gotta give it that chance. Matt Damon is just a huge personal comfort actor for me, and he's one of my favorite actors. Everything about this movie is just like comfy, everything about it. So when I don't know what to watch and I just wanna be comfy, Downsizing. Next up, we have Snowpiercer. Survivors of Earth after an ice age live out their days on a luxury train. However, the poorest citizens who live in the back of the train forge a plan to take over the engine room. This is another movie that I absolutely love to recommend to people who've never seen it because it's almost a guarantee you're gonna love it. Like, you're gonna be entertained by it. It's a nearly perfect movie. I love how we go through each of the train cars. We get to see the different lifestyles between the rich and the poor. It's obviously commentary on the class system, which I think Bong Joon-ho does very, very well. He also obviously made Parasite. But I love the casting for Snowpiercer, especially Tilda Swinton. Her role in this is probably my favorite role that she's ever done. There's just really nothing to dislike about this movie. There's serious parts, it's funny, it's dark, there's brutal elements, there's a lot of violence in it. It's beautiful. Like, everything about it is beautiful, and I just love the story. I love the concept of this post-apocalyptic world. Next up, we have Joker. Art Fleck, who's an aspiring comedian and clown, seeks connection in Gotham City, however remains disregarded by society as he slowly descends into madness. Now, I know the reputation that Joker has, especially when it came out. A lot of people make fun of men specifically for loving this movie, and I get it, you know, but this movie is perfect. This is, if someone asked me what is the most perfect movie you've ever seen, it would be Joker, because I would not change one thing about this movie. And I love DC for this reason, because I suspect that the Batman that we're getting in March 4th, is going to be very similar in tone, possibly, to Joker, because the trailers and the teasers that we've seen so far kind of makes it look like a horror movie, and it also is kind of getting that reputation already. Not to compare to Marvel, but I just think DC has way more darker elements to it, and obviously Joker is no exception because it's a very dark storyline, very violent. But I love the character of Art Fleck, and I love Joaquin Phoenix in this role, and it is my favorite role that Joaquin Phoenix has ever done. He was the perfect choice for this and is my favorite Joker. That might be controversial to say as well. Up next, we have The Hunger Games. YA dystopian is just my thing. That's why I'm writing a book in YA dystopian genre. I know it kind of died, you know, mid-2010s. It's not really a thing anymore, but just something about Divergent and Hunger Games, even Ugly's Pretty Specials, they're making movies on those soon. Just something about the dystopian YA genre appeals to me so much, and The Hunger Games, it's obviously the best one out of all of them, in my opinion, obviously. I reread the series last year, and it just still holds up. Like, I'm still obsessed with the YA dystopian genre, and I rewatch these movies constantly. All right, next up, we have another Matt Damon movie, of course, and that is The Martian. Mark Watney becomes stranded on Mars after a storm, and everyone assumes he's dead. However, he must now fight for survival as the team prepares their rescue mission. Again, Matt Damon, comfort actor, comfort movie. Makes me cry every time, though, whenever they play the David Bowie song in this. I don't know why. It's supposed to be like just a montage of like them working on saving him, but for some reason it makes me cry. I don't know what it is. But I specifically love sci-fi stories that are like this one, where they do feel a little bit more realistic. Obviously, we have not put people on Mars yet, but for some reason, something about the story feels like it could be in the near future, or, you know, at least in our reality, as I said before. That's just my favorite type of sci-fi movie. I had to add at least one animated movie in this, even though I'm typically not really drawn to them, but I do have a lot of favorites from my childhood. But my number one animated movie has to be Emperor's New Groove. Emperor Kuzco gets transformed into a llama by his advisor Yzma and must work together with Pacha to return back to the throne before she can finish the job. I mean, need I say more? It feels very weird to read a description about Emperor's New Groove on my horror channel, but I just had to put it in here because it's one of my favorite movies. It's a comfort movie. It's like part of my childhood. That and Hercules, I would say, are my top two favorite animated movies. Finally, we have first place of my favorite movie ever made, ever, and probably will never change. I don't see how it could possibly change because everything about this movie is perfect. Did you get it right? It is Interstellar. This has been my favorite movie of all time since 2017, which was the first time that I ever watched it. This follows a father who is asked to lead a mission to find the next habitable planet as droughts are slowly killing all crops on Earth. And it's so much more than that. Like, there's so much more going on in this movie. It's just beautiful. Again, this feels like one of those sci-fi stories where it fits into our reality. It almost feels like we are the grandparents in this era of this story, like we are just on the cusp of this storyline or this time period that it takes place in. This is also the most scientifically accurate movie based on what we know and understand of space as of now, so that to me just makes it even better. It didn't even have to be accurate. It didn't have to be. I would still love everything about this movie, even if every single thing was pretty fictional. I mean, the fact that it's realistic in the sense of how wormholes work and black holes and things like that just makes it so much better. Like, it's very, very well researched, clearly. Now, I've explained before, I have a special connection with this movie because I share a love of space with my dad, who I don't get to see very often or talk to that often. So obviously, the waterworks come on every single time I rewatch this movie, but that's really why this is my favorite and why I'm so drawn to it, is because I feel a personal connection to the characters. So there we have it. There we have my top 30 favorite movies. It was very difficult to make this list. Did any on this list surprise you of mine? Any that you think maybe I wouldn't like, but you got to know a little bit more about me because of the ones that I like? Please let me know your opinions about these movies. I would love to hear your top 30, but that's going to be like really long comments, so if you don't want to type that out, that's fine. You can just share your top 5 movies maybe of all time, or however much. I don't care. You could type your top 30. I don't care. I don't mind long comments, by the way, guys. You can write as many paragraphs as you want in your comments. Anyway, but yeah, share your thoughts, share your opinions. I would love to hear some also video requests that you maybe want to see from me in the month of February and March, and just in general, anything you want me to talk about. So yeah, leave your opinions down below. I hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.